Hello and welcome to ATG the podcast, and I'm very pleased to be talking to Gregory Laynor from NYU University. So you studied English at university, and what's more, English poetry. So why study English poetry?
Well, it was the financial crisis, 2008, so nothing better to do than to study poetry. That's a joke, but I was really interested in how poets think of poems as experiments. So maybe there actually was some prefiguration that I would end up working in a context of science and medicine, even though that was not at all my intent. And so I was looking at poets like Gertrude Stein, who thought of writing as experiment. She actually went to medical school, studied with William James, and was thinking about the human mind and the brain and how our patterns of language enact personality. And so there were already, I think, my core obsessions were about sort of how does language and sort of always exceed, there's always more to language than can map onto our actual bodies and lives. And likewise, there's more to our own bodily processes than language can ever encompass. So I was already in some ways thinking about some of the things that medical librarians think about, right? How do we, all of the nomenclature that's involved in describing medicine and bodily processes end up as mesh terms, right? There's certainly more to life than medical subject headings, which is the classification system in medicine. You could think of it as a kind of poetry, right? And how it evolves over time is was certainly interesting to me after I had to make a career shift just due to employment reasons. After teaching poetry and teaching actually at a program for interdisciplinary arts and sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I taught courses in things like media and embodiment, right? How do our interactions with media technologies change how we exist in the world, right? And so things that are often relate to digital health, right, and mental health in relation to our digital technologies. So they're already kind of my early interests. Were already at work. I taught a course in documents, right? Both in terms of how artists work with documents, like in documentary film, or also how we exist as documentary selves, right? That the Michael and the Gregory that exist in databases are alive even when we're sleeping, right? And might even have more impact on our lives than our actual bodily actions, right? And so I was already sort of thinking through some of these questions in a very, very different context of looking at how artists and poets explore these issues, and then migrated for my own survival into libraries and then medical libraries because that's where there were jobs. And yeah, so that's a that's my journey.
Fascinating. It's the first time I've seen
Yeah.
I've had pointed out a link between mesh terminology and literature. So that's remarkable. Your job today, your job title is systematic review librarian. So did you choose to focus on systematic reviews?
Yeah, I had never heard of a systematic when I was studying Gertrude Stein. I had never heard of a systematic review, though I was very interested in how do you find all of the evidence on something, right? Which was sort of the when I learned about systematic review, like, oh, that's already how I like to approach the world, right? How do we? And almost a utopian desire, right? How do you have all of the information on something, right? And the idea, and when I learned about systematic review, it something clicked, right? That and learned about Archie Cochrane, right? Who, in the sort of context of your National Health Service, I was trying to figure out how do we inform care based on evidence, right? How do we connect epidemiology, studying health at the level of population, to the actual care of a particular patient? And the whole idea of evidence-based medicine, right, which is the intersection of the best available evidence. And the idea is you conduct systematic reviews to collect all of that evidence, and not just published studies, but it could be unpublished studies that have very impactful evidence. So it's the best available evidence connected toward the expertise of the physician and then the values of the patient, right? And so all of those aspects ideally, with the sort of ideas of Archie Cochrane and the Cochrane collaboration and evidence-based medicine, it's that intersection. So the idea that what we're doing is not just sort of collecting a bunch of PDFs, but there's an aspect of interpretation. So someone trained in literary criticism and theory, maybe that appealed to that aspect of my own training. And then sort of the different stakeholders, right? The patient, the healthcare provider, the system in which they exist in, right? All of these different forms of information and knowledge and power all intersect. So that definitely became very interesting to me, more than just how do we get, the citation management software to function, though that is necessary in order to do this work, right? We have that a lot of the systems that we use, whether it's citation databases or citation management software or screening tools, or set up on very paper-based processes, not that different from when the Cochrane collaboration was founded in the 1990s. That 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 these if you look at the Cochrane handbook, which outlines the methods for systematic review, it estimates taking about a year with a large team. The reality is most people don't have that time, don't have the training. And so a lot of my sort of trajectory in libraries became, how do we make this more feasible to do, more reliable to do? Because you could find lots and lots of articles in PubMed with systematic review in their title that don't do any of the things that the Cochrane handbook outlines, right? And they're just adding to the glut of more articles out there. Whereas ideally, a well-done systematic review could actually enable evidence-based medicine. No one can keep up with the literature, even a clinician in their particular specialty. There could be, hundreds of new primary studies, even in a month. Who can keep up with that, right? But if there's really a well-done systematic review that not just collects the evidence, but evaluates it, appraises it, can be very valuable. And another thing I think that Cochrane has emphasized also is that making these systematic reviews accessible to patients themselves, right? To healthcare consumers. And so they always have a plain language summary. They document their methods, document limitations, because we're in an era where, it's, people talk about like Dr. Google or now Dr. ChatGPT, right? Everyone is, everyone is gathering information by some means, right? And that's part of just how healthcare is. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's tricky, obviously, in the environment we're in which there's so much suspicion, and coming out of the pandemic period. But I think that the general impulse to say that everybody should be involved in making their healthcare decisions is great, but not all of us have medical expertise, right? But being able to use some of the librarian skill set, like the reference interview, right? Clarifying a question, being able to evaluate different information sources, that cultivating that knowledge and making that possible broadly, whether it's through systematic reviews or through the kinds of education that librarians can be involved in, including educating future healthcare providers, right? Who, when you learn, it's funny, Michael, when I first heard of evidence-based medicine, what do you mean? Isn't medicine always evidence-based, right? But if you see how new clinicians, from medical students on, actually engage with information, it can sometimes be, I'm trying to find the right word, sometimes a bit unsettling, right? To see the reality, just because of pressures on time, right, and information overload. And so I think systematic review and evidence synthesis more broadly, these methods are more relevant than ever. It's just, how do we make it more feasible, and accessible and reliable, right? So I know I just said a lot there, but yeah.
No, very, very, very interesting. It's a great overview. So you see a role for the library in actually helping to interpret academic content for general readers.
I think that the interpretation, right, and evaluation of publications, of research, is actually going to become, or could become, even more important for libraries than being the repository of information. Um, because with the for a few reasons, right? That just the glut of material, because of the cost of generating material of all sorts, for better or for worse, because of large language models, right? That being able to validate um, what's, or even to identify what is something, right? That some of the traditional markers of reliability, like being published in a high-profile journal, right? Something's published in the Lancet, right? But you could prompt a chatbot, ChatGPT, create an article that looks like a Lancet
Mhm.
article very easily, right? And so even creating tools, I think not just one-on-one interactions or trainings, but actually creating tools to validate information, or to provide, you know, library patrons, if we still use that term, information to evaluate what they're looking at, right? Um, and when it comes to the medical literature, a lot of it's the study design, right? How were participants in the clinical trial recruited, right? What were the demographics? How well was the clinical trial designed in terms of blinding of, researchers and participants and clinicians, and that there could be sort of maybe signals, right, on anything that you're viewing, right, that would help inform what are you looking at, right? And I think that creating those frameworks, tools, systems is really going to be the role. Because if we do achieve some of the aims of open science, and the issues of access are no longer maybe as burdensome, right? And even if you see the policies that are being enacted for various reasons by the NIH in the United States, National Institutes of Health, right, which is actually pushing to make uh, government-funded research more accessible immediately, right? Now, figuring out how to make that happen is going to be a bigger
Mm.
challenge. But if we really move to the norm is open access, right? That libraries being repositories of subscription and licensed materials may become quite antiquated. Um, in fact, that would be a good problem to have. I mean, I think all of us should hope that we get to that point where we no longer need libraries to
Mm.
be repositories, because everything's open access, right? Now, maybe libraries are part of facilitating that process and making infrastructure for that, but that might be handled, that really could be handled at the government level, or larger organizations, right, in consortia that are doing that. And then libraries have more of a role in how do people access and interpret and synthesize those publications, rather than being the repository. I think if we cling to the repository role, I don't see much future for libraries. And maybe that's controversial, especially for the audience for this podcast. But I think a lot of this is going to happen at the level of publishers, funding bodies, governmental organizations, and libraries can be partners in that. But I think that the sort of I keep I just maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see the repository role as the best use of the talent and expertise
Mm.
of libraries and librarians.
You're a remarkable advocate for systematic reviews. In fact, listening to you speak, I notice all sorts of parallels with the whole concept of AI literacy, of learning to read academic content generally. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that there's now AI literacy, right, is sort of taken over from information literacy. But
Mm.
the fact of the matter is, Michael, we live and have lived even before ChatGPT an environment that is full of various forms of artificial intelligence, if we want to call it that. Machine learning has been part of our environment for quite some time now,
Mm.
right? And so understanding what it is and how predictions are made, right, and how they impact us in various ways. Um, that again, like the Michael and the Gregory that exist in databases, there are all kinds of ways that our data sets, right, are are doing things are being done with our data,
Mm.
and being aware of that, or being able to intervene in that, right? We're being able to use the capacities, right, of various AI approaches to proactively engage with
Mm.
information and of all sorts, whether it's in the realm of science or business or art, right? That
Mm.
that being able to create ways of at different scales accessing materials, I do think that's kind of what libraries have a unique role and have always had that
Mm.
role in. But I think that libraries are moving more through spaces of more creativity, whether it's in digital humanities or having maker spaces in libraries, or evidence synthesis, which is a creative process that requires, I think, a lot of traditional reference librarian skills, right? Like the reference interview, which is, it's kind of when I learned about it, I'm like, oh, this sounds like psychoanalysis, right? What's the question behind the question, right? Being able to listen and help someone interpret their query. And maybe there are, chatbots that can function in that way, like reference librarians, and help people refine their questions. Great, right? And like, maybe the role of librarians is to create better chatbots, right? I don't see anything. Why not, right? But this is the environment we're in, and so it's how do we interact with
Mm.
these various things being called AI, and the kinds of AI that we, right now, I think usually when people talk about AI, they're thinking about like large language model
Mm.
chatbots like ChatGPT,
Mm.
but there will be other forms of AI. If we have talk again in 5 years or 10 years,
Mm.
there will be, I even hear talk now of small language models that actually, for some purposes, large language models may be inefficient. And it might be
Mm.
that you, on your phone, all of your own data, you'll be having your own model that runs, and more agentic AI, right? Where,
Mm.
um, that the AI performs certain tasks for you.
Mm.
And so, it's yeah, I think it's just the environment we're in, and being able to
Mm.
understand it and create tools to engage with it. I definitely think libraries and librarians can be part of that, but it's going to be a change, right? Just like changing from a print based culture to a digital culture was a
Mm.
big leap. I think, though, still we interact with the digital culture as if it's print culture, right?
Mm.
It's and so I think this is different because it's more about not just collecting information, but more interpreting, synthesizing, questioning,
Mm.
um, material,
Mm.
documents and information. Um, so I know I keep coming back to that theme,
Mm.
but I think that's how things intersect. Yeah.
Great. You talk about machine learning and AI very much as sort of a part of the landscape. But I don't think I'm the only person to detect in relatively recent conferences about systematic reviews, or advocates of systematic reviews being extremely reluctant to allow any AI near the whole process. Do you think that's have you noticed that? I mean, is there widespread adoption of AI in systematic reviews?
It's a great question, Michael. I mean, people have been talking for, there's probably about 2 decades now of work on trying to implement various types of AI and machine learning into different stages of the systematic review process. And I don't know if we've talked in detail about the systematic review process, but it involves developing a protocol, developing a research question, developing search strategies, screening the studies, extracting data from the studies, critically appraising how the studies were done, synthesizing the studies, whether it's statistically through meta-analysis or thematic analysis, and various software, right, can be involved in all of that, but it requires lots of different tools, many of which require lots of human time and expertise and attention and energy. And so people have been trying to automate different steps, to varying success, right? And sometimes the time to evaluate or learn the tool, especially if you don't have programming skills, right, could be longer than doing the manual process,
Mm.
which, and so there have been some successes, but not as much, I think, as people had hoped for. And then with the rise of large language models like ChatGPT just in the past few years, that was sort of going to be maybe this will be the solution to our systematic review woes. And not really. In some ways, it's a mismatch of tools or approaches, because the way that large language models work is they're not doing really information retrieval in the way that we traditionally understand it by looking, a structured inquiry of a database. They're text prediction. They're doing text prediction. So in terms of formulating your question, or maybe being able to highlight patterns in after you've extracted data, great. But in terms of trying to identify citations systematically, it's inefficient and actually undermines that. So the whole point of a systematic review is to address some of the problems with, lack of comprehensiveness, or errors in, missing studies through the bias of a reviewer, or just human error in missing studies. And so actually a lot of AI approaches, especially the newer large language models, really could undermine the systematic review process, unless we can figure out other approaches that really are based in the needs of the research community, right? So there are techniques like retrieval augmented generation, where you might have the chatbot interaction, ChatGPT like interface, but then it actually goes and retrieves from a database, right? So there might be some potential there. However, one of the main sort of tenets of systematic review and research in general is that it should be reproducible, right? That you should be able to, if I do a systematic review and there's a protocol and a reported methods section, you, Michael, should be able to go and reproduce that review, and the results should be replicated, right? And so just the nature of how generative AI works is totally incongruent with that, where it's stochastic, right? There's random, it's random predictions, right? So there's good reason why people are skeptical and hesitant to just say, we're going to do a systematic review with ChatGPT, even though you could go in PubMed and find hundreds, if not thousands, not of so-called systematic reviews that say, that are basically prompting ChatGPT, right, to summarize some studies. And many of those studies they might be studies that should exist, right, but aren't, right, that don't exist, right? And so we now have a glut of citations of papers that don't exist in the medical literature. So it's like poetry, making things up. I mean, and so, however, I think that on the other, so there's these inefficiencies in the system. How do we make it more reliable? Are there ways we can use automation? My perspective is, if there's automation that works, let's use it, right? But we need to evaluate it. So sort of how do we apply the principles of evidence-based medicine, right, to these tools themselves, evaluating them, doing studies, validating them. Maybe for some projects, where you don't need 100, close to 100% accuracy, maybe it's fine to do a broad scoping review of how something being studied, right? Or what are broad trends in the research. That might be a case where certain tools are fine. However, if you need to make treatment recommendations for whether a drug should be approved for regulation, there might the level of rigor and reliability is higher, right? So being able to make these decisions, I think, is where, again, librarians have an important role. So I developed for the Medical Library Association a continuing education webinar on how to have these conversations with researchers, right? To use our skills as librarians to say, here are the studies evaluating these tools for these steps in the process. Does this make sense, or is it actually going to undermine the whole purpose of doing a review, right? And then from that, I was invited by Cochrane to edit a special issue of their methods journal, the Cochrane Evidence Synthesis and Methods Journal on AI, right? To really start to publish an evidence base on these tools, right? So kind of applying the principles of evidence-based medicine onto the automation tools themselves, so people can make informed decisions, right? And if you have, a hospital executive say, "When are you investing all this time in doing a systematic review? Just use AI," and to be able to say, actually, the evidence shows maybe it's not reliable yet, or to a developer who's made some tool who doesn't understand the context of research, right? To say, actually, we need tools that can, give calculate how much uncertainty they have, right? So we can report that. So really trying to and that goes into the whole idea of meta science, that approaching research challenges by doing research on our research practices, right? Anyway,
Yeah, I take
yeah,
your point about. I agree absolutely about Gen AI being predictive, but machine learning, as you say, is a probabilistic tool which gives you statistical likelihood of success.
right.
And I have to say that my first encounter, my first encounter with systematic reviews, I have to say my jaw dropped when I saw the length of some of the Boolean strings, that sort of the Boolean search strings that were put together. I cannot believe that such a lengthy Boolean search sequence, which then has to be revised for every different software
Database,
database it's
yes.
being used on, strikes me as an incredibly labour-intensive and probably not very precise way of finding content.
Yes. Yes. And it used to be that there were like excellent medical librarians, information specialists, as they call them in the Cochrane collaboration,
Mm,
who created really advanced ways of doing this. Carol Lefebvre is very well known, as like a celebrity in the systematic review
mm,
world for really creating best practices for doing that, right? For where that really you do need that well-developed strategy. However, the fact of the matter is most library and information science schools don't teach how to create Boolean searches
mm,
or the structure of medical subject headings mesh, or
mm,
every database, like you were mentioning, has their own structured vocabulary, right? So it's sort of it's a prior generation of librarians who have been trained in this, and so now people aren't even trained in it, and so because it's actually quite difficult, and it's very labor intensive,
mm,
right? um, and so to do it well takes so much time. But even if you do it well, if you're the best of the best, a librarian's librarian, kind of, a really, really kind of it there are, just by the nature of Boolean searching, and because it's usually titles and abstracts that are indexed rather than full text, um, it's difficult to do. And even then, you need to use other means to identify studies. So I think that machine learning, like you mentioned, right? If you already know that there's certain kind of what would be called gold standard studies or exemplary, like we know these meet our criteria in the protocol, how do we find other studies like that? Can we use machine learning to do that? And the
mm,
answer is yes, right? And there are some studies that evaluate it. And even more simply than that is what's called sometimes citation snowballing, or citations chaining, right, where you're
mm,
looking at what's cited, almost more of a bibliometric approach, right?
mm,
What are the networks of
mm,
citations? Because if something is citing a study meets your criteria,
mm,
higher chance that it's going to be also relevant, rather than
mm,
trying to cast this broad net, even with a Boolean search, which tries to filter out what's going to stay in the net.
mm,
So there are techniques, right, to improve this,
mm,
but um, the fact of the matter is the standard still is to do Boolean searches with such structured vocabulary, and there are very few people who are trained in doing it well, or have the patience to do it
mm,
well, or the time.
mm,
It used to be that medical libraries might have a whole team of people creating these search strategies, or teaching medical students how to construct these search strategies, and its library staffs are much smaller, right? People have
mm,
much more pressure on their time.
mm,
It's also just so that it's incongruent with how rapid we're used to doing most things,
mm,
and so creating new forms of information retrieval is obviously necessary, and there has been some
mm,
developments. But the fact of the matter is, has it been widely adopted? No.
mm, mm.
Um,
Well, going back to systematic reviews, it's very interesting. They as you say, they originated maybe some sort of 50 years ago. So they've now there's been a dramatic growth in the use of systematic reviews. Are they used for? They're most frequently used for clinical practice guidelines. Saying what the best intervention should
exactly.
be for this or that issue. But are they used for all clinical practice guidelines? Are they used across the board?
Well, that depends, right? And it depends both geographically and across clinical specialties. And there are also systematic review like evidence synthesis methods that are used for pharmaceutical regulation, um, and policy making. So it really depends on geography, clinical specialty, healthcare system, right? But it's so there are a variety of uses, and also uh, population level studies, right? Looking at for example, epidemiology, right? Could also systematic review methods could be really important to use.
Mm.
So, but I guess sort of I think what your question was getting at, Michael, is like, are they broadly used? Like, does every clinical decision, is it
Yeah.
informed by a systematic review?
Mm.
I think there are two main sort of pathways that the systematic review either might be commissioned or used. Is either a regulatory body of some sort requires it for approving a new medical device or drug, or a particular clinical specialty, gastroenterology, for let's say that they are going to make, new standards, right,
Mm.
for colonoscopy, let's say, right, like that, commissioning systematic reviews or reviews of reviews, umbrella reviews, which
Mm.
would be systematic reviews of systematic reviews in order to inform new guidelines,
Mhm.
right? So, but it varies again in terms of how well they're done or how widely adopted they are.
Mm.
So I don't, does that answer your question,
Yeah,
or?
pretty much. No, my question is really about if the method's so great, should it not be universally adopted? I suppose that's the sort of that's the question.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the other thing I want to mention is that I think where systematic reviews actually probably most frequently do get, I don't even know if read is the right word, but the findings
Used.
end up
Mm.
being maybe used, are in what in libraries we would call clinical decision support tools, or
Mm.
like Up to Date,
Yeah,
for example,
yeah.
right? Where there are sort of the findings of
Mm.
various forms of evidence, including systematic
Mm.
reviews, would be kind of quickly, summarized and
Mm.
disseminated, and kind of put on a hierarchy of reliability.
Mm.
So it's kind of pre-appraised evidence,
Mm.
if you will. When there's a good systematic review, that's
Mm.
what oftentimes a clinician, in between seeing a patient, if they're looking on their phone on Up to Date,
Mm.
um, that's what they would say, right? That the
Yeah.
sort of finding, but they're probably not going to go and read the whole systematic review unless
Mm.
there's sort of some maybe rare disease,
Mm.
or they're
Mm.
looking at, comorbidities and
Mm.
need to sort of understand a
Mm.
different clinical area. So might read a
Mm.
systematic review, or
Mm.
drug interactions,
Mm.
right? And there are also, drug databases where they would pull in some of this
Mm.
information. So sometimes it's not the actual, systematic review published in the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet or whatever specialty
Mm.
journal. It's actually kind of being disseminated in other ways. So we call it the evidence pipeline, right?
Mm. Systematic reviews, of course, they're most used in healthcare. But looking at your background in literature and humanities, you could see them just as a sort of as a more tightly organized kind of literature review. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and they have been. I mean, the methods, and actually, I mean, medicine kind of claims the creation of the systematic review and the meta-analysis, but actually borrowed a lot of the methods, including meta-analysis itself, from education and psychology, right? So for more behavioral sciences, social sciences, a lot of the methods were actually developed there and then imported into medicine and more widely adopted. And the Cochrane collaboration had a lot to do with that. But there's also the Campbell collaboration, which is more sort of social sciences, social care. Um, in terms of, though, the literature review, right, and why someone who went from studying structures of literature, right, or structures within poems, to the structure of the medical literature, both within the article and then more broadly, right, that, yeah, and there's often every day I run into people who are very confused that they, systematic review is just a big literature review, or it's just a summary of studies, and yes, it has elements of that, but it's not just that, in that it's also appraising and evaluating the
Mm.
studies
Mm.
and synthesizing, right,
Mm.
the findings. So it goes beyond just identifying the studies
Mm.
comprehensively. That's, again, one thing that makes a difference between systematic review and your, sometimes we call it narrative review, which doesn't mean that it's less than that. Actually, some of that interpretive
Mm.
work is really, really important. There's actually a pretty famous primary care physician and evidence-based medicine guru in the UK, Trish Greenhall, who wrote a book called How to Read a Paper. And she's actually an advocate for, major figure in evidence-based medicine, improving systematic review methods, but also an advocate for sort of narrative, really well done literature reviews and narrative reviews that look at the role of language and interpretation and how different phenomena and people are categorized, right, and how it's communicated. And so I don't think that there's a tendency sometimes in systematic review community to think as narrative review as less than, but actually, this is my background too, is like narrative and communication and how things are named is really, really important. But, I think you can combine the strengths of sort of narrative interpretation and communication with the rigor and structure of systematic review methods. But they're used in all kinds of fields. I mean, you were pointing to that, Michael, that not just, medicine, and not just even within healthcare. It's not just like, is this treatment, result in, mortality in this population compared to this other treatment or standard of care, right? There are many, many questions that are looking at, what are the drivers of healthcare disparities, right? Or why are certain populations more susceptible to a certain condition, right? And so, or how, what kinds of studies are being done on something. And so you might do a scoping review to sort of map out how something is being studied. And these methods have been disseminated and adapted and I think experimented with in other fields to kind of adjusting them to their needs in all kinds of fields, not so much in the humanities, but I think across the social sciences, engineering, business, that there's a lot of work in trying to sort of, how do we create, using existing literature, right, to synthesize findings, both because of information overload issues, nobody can read everything, and also being able to evaluate and even make new discoveries from the literature. And something really I'm interested in is what's called literature-based discoveries. Sometimes there are papers that never get cited, but might have, so-called sleeping beauty findings, right? That just kind of people say the same papers tend to get cited again and again, but there could be papers that just, net because they're in a less known journal or from the global South, right? Or from maybe somebody who's doing interdisciplinary work or an early career researcher who didn't get funding or something, and there could be really impactful findings. How do we pull out some of that, identify promising but under recognized research, and that, I mean, it obviously has a potential benefit in medicine, but I think lots of other fields, being able to use the literature as data, looking at things at different scales. And it's also not just the literature, right? That it's also, I mean, in systematic reviews that there's now a push to using the electronic health record, right? So why just look at a small, clinical trials published in some journals? Why we could have 500,000 patient records, and let's use that in our systematic review and see is that, what we're seeing patterns using machine learning to identify patterns across patient records. Is that consistent with what we're finding with, tightly designed randomized trials, right? Or running virtual randomized trials. We could say, we have all these patients with this characteristic. Let's simulate them, right, based on their patient data and do reviews on that. So I know I'm going off on lots of directions, but there's a lot of going on, I think, in this broader, field of evidence synthesis that goes beyond, that builds upon the foundation of literature review, but goes beyond just the article as form. Yeah.
So from what you're saying, it may not be entirely far-fetched to imagine that you could envisage giving all PhD students, not just in medicine, sort of training in how systematic reviews work and what can be learned from them from that approach.
Exactly. Yes, I think that there are programs in lots of fields now where maybe a chapter of your dissertation, right, would be a systematic review, or the whole project could be a systematic review. And I think there's now an understanding that it's not just secondary or tertiary research, or it's not, you give a research assistant or give a student, it's not real research. That actually, when well done, right, it can be incredibly impactful, can be a form of discovery, generating new knowledge, right? But I think at the very least, understanding the basics of the process, right? Even if you're not, maybe you go off and do innovative things both with the methods or in using the methods, but just knowing the fundamentals of the systematic review process, I think is vital. But I can, and it's something that I'm working on. How do we more broadly disseminate training? It's difficult, right? I think that there's still, unless you've done a systematic review, it's I think that it's I get emails probably every day, honestly. I was told to, from a very maybe eager undergraduate student who's trying to apply to medical school and they want to get something on their CV, and I was they have an internship with a clinician investigator, told to do a systematic review. I'm trying to do a systematic review over the weekend, right? And they come into my inbox and they need a course, right? Or they need, and these projects, I don't know if I've mentioned this, they require interdisciplinary teams, that you need someone with the domain expertise, whether it's clinical knowledge or whatever field of inquiry. You need statistical expertise if you're doing something like a meta-analysis, or somebody who can do data visualizations or do a structured thematic analysis. You need an information specialist to either create those Boolean strings or to use other techniques that have been validated for the purposes of that review. You need people to do the screening, or people to implement and monitor the AI, right? You need people to write the findings and disseminate the findings. So these projects take large teams, but the reality is that it's often an undergraduate student who, can, send them to the library. They'll show them how to do a systematic review. Meanwhile, I teach a course for its, epidemiology PhD students who they realize, oh my God, this is really quite difficult to do. And so, and these are people with a lot of expertise, can be very difficult to do. And so we need to create better trainings and also funding to be able to do these. And retraining people, that maybe certain roles in libraries might become redundant, but there could be training people they don't have to become, physicians, but they could become, being able to do what I do, right? Is to be able to facilitate these collaborations, right? To bring all these different forms of knowledge and expertise together. And how do you write a protocol for that, right? How do you clarify what you're really doing? Things that actually, especially reference librarians traditionally are very good at. So,
This leads us to the you've used the dreaded word meta several times, and to your initiative, which was founded, I believe, just earlier this year, the Meta Research Collaborative. So tell us about that. How did that come about?
Thanks for asking about it, Michael. It's a lot of what I think about in addition to systematic reviews. And I'll kind of clarify what we mean by meta research or meta science, not to be confused. There's the company Meta, or sometimes people think, is this just jargon or branding or pretentious? And maybe it is. But so it came, my connection to it, I had heard of systematic reviews sometimes mentioned as meta research, right? Research on research, research that's using other research. So one way of thinking about it is all the stuff that we've been talking about so far, right? Research that builds on other research, synthesizes existing research, meta research, right? But it's also doing research on research. How do we improve the way research is done or disseminated, which connects to open science or connects to issues with the rigor and reproducibility of studies, right? So there's the kind of that side of doing research on how research is performed, communicated, evaluated in order to improve research and its impact. And the way that I had been interested in all of these things and work that the Center for Open Science does, and work that scholars like John Ioannidis at Stanford has done on sort of questions about the lack of rigor in studies, and sort of how, not necessarily intentional fraud, but sort of misaligned incentives in the research system to publish too quickly and so forth. Sort of how do, I'd been interested in all of these things. I didn't necessarily know that there was a way of talking about all of these things with one nice term, meta research, which actually our team here ended up getting a mesh term created for meta research. And we wrote an article in the Journal of the Medical Library Association trying to sort of get the National Library of Medicine's attention to create this mesh term. But I intersected with this was actually now my collaborator, Elizabeth Stevens, who's a population health researcher whose research was on basically aging research, right? Geriatrics, of sort of what are the research networks, right, in that field. And so she became a meta researcher and came to me with a question for us. Can we do a scoping review on how, initially it was with geriatric research, but in general, how are researchers researched? Can you develop a search strategy for all of the studies on where researchers are the research subjects? And you can imagine, Michael, how difficult that is to do. With, how many, the titles of abstracts of most research articles mention research or researchers. So how do you do that? And we developed a protocol to do a scoping review, starting off just with health research, right? Or how are researchers researched? And as we did have the protocol published in PLOS One, but ran into just difficulties of how do you deal with 15,000, even after a very refined, tested, evaluated search strategy that we had peer-reviewed and published, being able to actually do this process. And we will need to use machine learning to be able to do this, or maybe even just be able to do a sample, right, of this. But so I, most people had turned to her, Liz said, this is no one, this can't be done, right? I said, oh, this is great. Like, how do we do this? How do we do this? And then from there, we ended up having other collaborations about studying the research process, questions about research training. We were just talking, Michael, about how do people, actually every PhD student, every student should learn the systematic review method, right? Why is that not the case, right? What would need to be done in institutions to create more training? And who's recruited to be a researcher, right? So some of the work I'm involved in is, people from underrepresented, over-impacted communities are, the research being done on them is often not done by them. Right. And so I think I was able to say that without using the DEI word, but maybe we should edit that out. I'll get canceled. But basically, in order to actually understand sort of impactful, really crucial issues in research, we need to think about who's doing the research, right? Or how are, and so all of these questions, kind of things that I had been already kind of working on, and lots of people working on, including librarians. Like, you may be a meta researcher without knowing it. It's a way to give a name to that work and to be able to say, actually, there are all kinds of problems with research, with research and how it's disseminated or implemented in society, right? That especially in the post-pandemic period, where breakdowns of trust and communication and there are challenges, right? Funding, dissemination. Also, we're in light of generative AI. How do we even know if this is real, right? Or even, and that, so meta research or meta science enables ways of putting some attention, not for navel gazing, right? But be able to actually, I think, make pragmatic interventions, bringing together lots of different forms of expertise in different communities and people impacted, by research, right, and science, to be able to make improvements in the system, or at least talk about certain things. So I think also, like, one of the questions, right, is what's the difference between meta science and meta research? I think meta science would be broadly sort of the science of science, right? Like, and there, or fields like history of and philosophy of science, or sociology of science, or that the sort of, it's the knowledge base of science, studying science, right? Whereas I think meta research is a bit more applied, right? Like trying to conduct research to improve or address problems in the research system, right? That might draw upon the body of knowledge in meta science, but also contribute to it. But meta research is like the applied practice, I think, is how I understand it, right? And so in a context of, we're based at a medical school, at a large research university, but I think at a medical school, it's so, everything is so, which I like, is so pragmatic, right? It's about actual, like, human beings in a healthcare setting, right? That facing, mortality, let's say, or various health outcomes, right? That it's very much, there's no time for navel gazing. I like that pressure, actually, because it's sort of how, they're obviously, like, most research never gets read, right? There are many conditions in which there's no research, or it's difficult to do research,
Mm.
right? Or that there are people impacted by uh, environmental health issues who don't necessarily aren't able to participate in research. Right? So all kinds of problems, but I see them as opportunities. And meta research, it's kind of like the research and development wing of the research university or the research system, not navel gazing. Nothing wrong with concept. I mean, I came from the humanities, contemplating things or just doing something, studying something for the sake of studying it, or taking kind of a big picture approach like the philosophy of science would do. I love all of that, right? But it is very much like, oh, we have a challenge in the research system. For example, systematic reviews are mostly done really terribly, and they take a really long time to do well. What can we do about this, right? How can we do research on AI to improve, to see, are there ways that we can reliably make these processes more efficient? That's meta research.
I can understand the distinction. I'm just not entirely sure that the world in general sort of acknowledges that distinction between meta science and meta research. Nonetheless, a couple of practical questions. So, how many people are there in your group, and how are you funded?
Yes. It's Liz, my collaborator Elizabeth Stevens, and I co-direct this, and we have some research assistants who part of their time is some of the efforts that we're doing. We have support for our first inaugural symposium, which we hope to be an annual symposium. So the inaugural one will be next month, October 20th, and also it's hosted here on site at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York for people who are here, but it's also, there's virtual participation as well. And so we have some speakers sort of keynoting some of these larger themes, but also lightning talks and posters from researchers at various stages of their careers and various research areas, mostly health related, but not only. Presenting sort of how they either calls for action or needed meta research, or projects they're doing that to improve, certain research practices or address challenges with research. So we have support from our what's called the Center for Translational Science, or CTSI, Translational Science Institute, to have this conference. And so, and then hopefully to have an ongoing series of speakers. For other projects, we will need, outside funding. So we have some things in the works to, some grants in hopefully that will come through so that we can do some training initiatives, right? Not just people who are in a PhD program who can take a 1-credit course in rigor and reproducibility, or a 3-credit course in systematic reviews, but practicing clinicians, or the many people who work as research staff, like the people who actually do the work of running the clinical trial, right? Having more opportunities for professional development and training for them, being able to carry out projects like evidence syntheses on the research system, right? And so we hope to get funding for that, and ideally also make funding available, right, for pilot projects where people want to do something in their lab or their department or their program, like, oh, maybe there's some inefficiency in how research is being done. Can we try to study this, apply research to trying to improve something in our local context, that then we would disseminate and contribute to meta science, right? To say, okay, there's getting people to respond to surveys, right? So a lot of research, population health research requires surveys. It's very difficult these days to get people to fill out surveys, but maybe there's some technique that could be developed to improve survey response rates, or an alternative way of doing that kind of research. And so we could have trainings or here are some practices, here's a grant to try this out. And then you publish your findings, right? And then there could be systematic reviews. What are the best ways of getting people to, could participate in research, right? So that's how we see this hopefully unfolding, but building it initially in the context of the medical school and the health system with support from our CTSI. And then we'll go from there, and hopefully more of our time, we have our other roles, right, funded in other ways, that we could be able to devote more time to these efforts and have also PhD students and more staff and so forth is the dreams. If there are any funders listening, if the Wellcome Trust
You're interested.
is listening, Michael can send you my email address. So you can...
Sounds to me like you mentioned adding a mesh code for meta research, and it may be that one of the great achievements, although this might seem sort of really trivial, is just to pull together a lot of pre-existing research that has been carried out, but nobody ever reads because they can never find it.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And I think curating sort of and highlighting that could be really be useful. There is I don't know if we spoke about it. There's the Meta Science Conference that exists. It was just held this summer at University College London, which brought together lots of people, which is unusual. Like, you know, scientists from lots of different fields. People from philanthropies and funders, government agencies, journalists, librarians, all in one space to talk about all of the kinds of things we've been talking about. And I think, and also just challenges. I mean, geopolitical impacts on how research collaborations across countries are and sharing of data and all of the utopia of open science. There are real world challenges to that. And changes to funding, speaking of the United States, right? That, you know, or you know, challenges between gaps between researchers and the public, right? Which are not new questions. People have been talking about this. There's a, you know, you may know J.D. Bernal, who was wrote the sort of, I think it was called, was it
Science and
The
History.
Social Function of Science back in, I think, 1920s, right? Addressing a lot of the things that were being talked about at the Meta Science Conference, right? Of you know, who sets priorities for what research is done, right? There are limited resources. How is research communicated? How does the layperson or the public interact with this, right? And so these are not new questions at all. But I do think there is a lot of attention now to it, because, you know, some people would describe research as being in or science or medicine being in crisis. But there's certainly challenges, right? But I think I love your idea of sort of how to highlight some of the experiments that are being done. So there are funders that, for example, they're using like randomized trials on, you know, if we evaluate grants this way compared to this way, do we select the most impactful projects, right? So using research techniques to improve research and being able to see this as a sort of an opportunity to innovate and create and build, I think is more of a positive. Without sugarcoating, there are some real challenges, you know, geopolitically and even, you know, that yes, there are problems with research. I don't know if the solution is to just totally remove funding from it, but I think being open to saying and bringing in people, you know, English literature PhDs into science, or being people who have no degrees into science, I think is a real actual opportunity, right? But also valuing expertise, right? And helping, you know, enabling people with expertise to build that trust and communicate their research, so it doesn't just stay in the lab, or just, you know, or they have incentives to be part of communicating their research and not just getting the next grant, right? And so I think there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, it's very scary, challenging times, and we all need more funding to be able to do this work, but I do think the dissemination efforts are really important. And obviously libraries and librarians
have a role,
have real opportunities, I think, with, you know, being centers for meta research, right? And I think it was the Center for Open Science just had a webinar about sort of libraries and open science, and not just questions of open access, which is kind of comfortable in our lane, right? How do we deal with, you know, publication costs and so forth, but also that libraries can be part of producing research on addressing challenges in the research system is something I would advocate for. Yeah.
Finally, but you mentioned English literature. So after a day busy doing systematic reviews, do you still get a chance to do you still turn to poetry for entertainment? And what do you are you still reading?
Not. I hate to confess, not as much anymore. And So, but I still do. I'm someone like visual art is really important to me, and music and poetry.
Mm.
So it's still, and I'm in New York, so there's lots of things around to see. But do I sit down and read poetry as much anymore? Not so much. Maybe I'll return to it at some point, but mostly reading, articles about systematic review methods and evaluating AI, and writing protocols for systematic reviews, which is kind of like writing a poem, except sort of for real, right? That's sometimes I say I do poetry, but for real life, in some ways. But there's definitely, yeah, I mean, I'm glad I had the opportunity to have time to study and teach poetry without necessarily needing to prove its value, and I hope other people continue to do that. I know their higher education and the arts are challenged, and even in my own life, it's now I wish I had more time to read poetry. But
well, we shouldn't complain too much, because from what you're doing in the whole area of systematic reviews, and your fascinating description of the meta research collaborative suggests that there are great things that could be coming out from this new unit in future years. So I, for one, I will certainly I've signed up for the symposium, and I'll certainly look forward to hearing more about what your unit comes up with. So it's been great fun talking to you, Gregory, and highly enjoyable. And thanks very much for your time.
And thank you for your questions, Michael, and thanks for having me on. Yeah.